So, if you've looked at my channel at all, you've probably seen a couple of videos where I animated these various colorful characters with the words Lake Amenity somewhere in the video title. If you've ever wondered what that whole thing was about, and what happened to it, this is the video where I'm going to talk about it, including what I learned after I decided not to continue it. Since I feel like, as a creative person, it's always healthier to look back at your quote-unquote failed projects and try to learn from them, as opposed to just wallowing in self-pity for not living up to capitalistic ideas of perfection and completionism. So let's start with the origins. Lake Amenity started as a loosely defined project I made way back in 2018, while I was still in my last years of high school. If I wanted to be really pedantic, though, I could say the origins of this story go even further back, since a lot of the characters were ripped straight out of a roleplay I started with a friend in 2014. However, I stopped talking to that friend in 2018. So I figured it was kind of fair game to just take the characters I liked, rename and redesign them, and write my own little world about them. Which is exactly what I did throughout 2018 all the way to 2023. By the time I started animating these characters in multi-animator projects, though, the story and characters were near unrecognizable compared to their roleplay origins. Which is pretty typical nowadays, like for people starting their own little series or comics. Long before I had first started creating Lake Amenity, though, I had a dream of making my own cartoon series. I lived in Vancouver at the time, too, which is considered one of the animation capitals of Canada. So I was fairly certain after high school that was the career I wanted to pursue. So since I was creating Lake Amenity in my last year of high school, I decided that would be the cartoon I wanted to make once I got into the industry. But then, something funny happened in 2020. Don't know if any of you know about it, but it kind of ended up derailing a lot of those life goals. Then my family decided to move away from Vancouver during late 2020. We moved to a smaller town, and when 2022 came around, the restrictions started to loosen, so I got a job, and I held on to that for around 2 years, I think. So I felt very aimless in my future plans at that point. So with that all in mind, since I had developed Lake Amenity for about 4 to 5 years at that point, I figured I should just start telling the story of Lake Amenity and figure out where I wanted to post it on the internet instead. Which is exactly what I started doing. Now, despite how disappointing it was to drop this project, don't assume I didn't put my whole boy pussy into developing the story over the course of the pandemic. I drafted an outline for the plot, I made a lore bible of various flora and fauna that lived in the world. I also made a document writing down the various character arcs I wanted each character to go through. So, with all those documents on hand, I was able to write the first episode of the script. Originally, I had went into this thinking I would make a webcomic at first, but after sketching some of the pages, I realized that I strongly preferred a video format. I just wanted to be able to hear these characters speak and see them move, even if it was, limited movement. So I decided to go for like a visual novel style. I also rounded up some lovely voice actors who were kind enough to volunteer their voices for this project. I seriously cannot thank them enough, even to this day. So if you ever watch the first episode of Lake Amenity, please be sure to look at the description and thank the people who were involved. So after I decided to go for that visual novel style, I spent about a year drawing all the assets for episode 1. I kept telling myself that drawing all these assets now will save me time later since I get to reuse them again and again for future episodes. But I was burning myself out faster than I realized until it was too late. Which, honestly, any artist worth their salt could have told me that at the time. But honestly, who knows if I even would have listened back then. If it isn't obvious, I'm a rather stubborn person. I'm working on it, though. But I still managed to finish the first episode in the end, which I am still proud of because, damn it, this took me so long and it turned out pretty good in the end for something made by one person. Then it was time to work on episode 2. It wasn't just the daunting amount of drawing to do again, though. I was dealing with other personal issues at the time, and the insecurity from that just bled over into every corner of my life. I just became so uncertain and anxious about my future and the future of Lake Amenity, which was a sign that something had to change. So, I decided that this story was too ambitious for one person to make, and I'd have to shelve it. If anything, just to keep my mental health in check. So, with that all in mind, maybe you're wondering, what was Lake Amenity really about? Especially since I claimed it to be a very ambitious story, yet the public information I've posted about it is rather vague. So I'll enlighten you a little bit. Against your will, because I'm sure you're all very, very riveted by this story about some old OCs I had. For starters, I was inspired by a lot of different media, and one thing I had a habit of doing is seeing something cool in a TV show or a movie and being like, I'm adding that to Lake Amenity now. Which is a great way to add unnecessary bloat to a story and make it very inconsistent theme-wise. I mean, it was extremely self-indulgent fun, but it makes the story itself stuffed to the brim to the point where it gets overwhelming to me. Anyway, the setting was definitely fantasy adjacent since there was magic and made up creatures, plus the locations were very whimsical with towns made from giant mushrooms and cities made from treehouses. I guess Pokemon was an unintentional influence when it came to the settings and locations. But regardless, my investment was more so in the characters. I won't go into every character, but I'm just gonna go into the protagonist and maybe some others. The main character was Cass, obviously. I mean, if you've seen episode 1, you would obviously know that. Now, I intended for the first few episodes to set up everyone's character arcs, and Cass started off the story as very timid, but very put off by how many people seem to judge them for things that are very beyond their control. So they wanted to prove they could be strong and independent when given the chance. I tried to depict this kind of thing in episode 1 in relation to their ability to do magic, and I like to think I got the point across as well as I could have at the time, given my writing capabilities back then. Regardless, I liked Cass a lot as a protagonist, since I like wimpy protagonists for their relatability, but it was also kind of a struggle since I kept associating shyness with passivity. This isn't inherently bad, but generally speaking, protagonists are more entertaining when they're proactive in driving the story forward. I tried to fix that where I could, but people tell me they still enjoyed Cass as a character, so maybe I was just a harsh critic. Regardless, I still learned a lot from making a character like Cass. Not sure if I will make another one like Cass, but they taught me a lot. Now, I could go into other side characters who surrounded Cass's life, like their dads, Lawrence and Fletcher, or Arya and Axel, or Varsha, but I know how the internet works at this point, so I'll just skip to the villain of this story, of which was a Tumblr sexy man looking guy I named Silas, who was the leader of the town Cass lived nearby, which was called Vorpalis, by the way. Now, I didn't really want to make Silas a complex villain, though. Instead, I reveled in making him as horrible as possible, without making him an outright bigot, though. He was abusive, controlling, and extremely petty to anyone who slighted him. He also didn't really have, a character arc. He was just kind of the main instigator of conflict for most of the story. I ended up drawing him a lot, though, considering how much I liked drawing angst back then, and I just didn't really want to give too much angst to my child protagonists, just because I don't like seeing excessive harm happen to children. The TLDR, though, is that Silas was a jerk, and he wasn't really much more nuanced than a teenager's edgy DeviantArt OC. which I say lovingly because he was technically a DeviantArt OC himself. I'm also going to highlight a character I named Archer. He basically became my main blorbo for Lake Amenity, which is probably evidenced by how much I drew him both on this channel and on Toy House. Yet, he was barely important to the overall story. He started out as a henchman of sorts to Silas, but then I made him one of Silas's victims, and it was all downhill from there. Or uphill, I suppose. The point I want to make with Archer, though, is that I feel like I see a lot of artists and writers do this, where they create a character and develop them a little bit, only for like a switch to go off in their brain, and suddenly that new OC has more depth and narrative importance than their own protagonists. It's not a bad thing inherently, especially, if you just do this as a hobby for fun, but if you're someone who gets, insecure about not focusing on your quote-unquote important characters, then I'm here to tell you something. You can just make that Blorbo OC you're obsessed with into the new protagonist and make your narrative about them instead. Which is what I did with Archer, but I'll get more into that later. I'm just here to say that if you get fixated on an OC to the point they're more interesting than any other character, then just make them your protagonist. As I'm a firm believer that your protagonist should be the most interesting character in a fiction story. Anyway, there is a bunch of other ideas I had for Lake Amenity, clearly, but there were just too many ideas that I couldn't fit into one story. But that doesn't mean I'll throw all of them away. So, this is just kind of a heads up to say that I might mention Lake Amenity in future videos if I have a point to make, but since it's not being revived anytime soon, I figure I'll just leave it there and move on to what I learned from this project. So, let's go over the 6 lessons I learned from Lake Amenity. Now, I just have to put a disclaimer, which is that none of what I'm about to say here are hard rules for creating a fiction story. If you're writing a story and you disagree with what I say, then that's okay, because these are mostly just lessons I've learned for myself, and I'm spelling them out in hopes that someone else might find them useful. Additionally, none of this advice is intended for kids and teenagers who just create OCs for fun. Policing children's creativity is not something I will ever encourage. With that out of the way, let's move on to lesson number 6. Don't care what others think, but within reason. One of the things that stressed me out a lot about Lake Amenity was the pressure I put on myself for it to be a good story, with good characters. Not a fun story, but a good story. Ever since I was a teenager, I've followed quite a bit of media analysis channels because it's just something that interests me, but also because a lot of the advice these channels give about storytelling is good advice, at least by my novice standards. The thing about art and storytelling, though, is that it's subjective, obviously. But it means that even if someone's storytelling advice is good, it's not going to be universal to every story ever made. Which is also why it's unwise to trust a stranger who tries to prove that a story is good purely based on its tropes. Because tropes are just hollow categories at the end of the day and cannot determine quality. So despite the fact that it's capitalism's goal for art to be as universally appealing as possible, that is damn near impossible to achieve. So, since that's a stupidly high bar to achieve, it's far easier to make stories about whatever you personally like to write about. Whether it's Stickman cartoons from Newgrounds, furry magical girls, or demon vampires from hell. As long as you're having fun with it, then I think people are more likely to connect with it even if it's got an unconventional premise. I got far too self-conscious about Lake Amenity being quote-unquote good by chasing empty tropes and trying to give it a level of fake prestige in hopes that would get people to like it, but I ended up making it less fun for me personally, which ultimately was part of why I didn't want to make it anymore. Also, I added the within reason bit at the start because while I do believe in unlimited creativity, there are a lot of artists out there who will justify creating hurtful art with the excuse of self-expression or claiming criticism as censorship. So, don't care about what others think about your art and all that, but if one of your friends tells you that one of your characters might be playing into harmful stereotypes of a marginalized community, then it's probably better to respond by asking what's harmful about it and how you can fix it, as opposed to getting defensive or claiming the other person is overreacting. Just figured I'd put that out there, since, nuance is important with this kind of subject. Okay, moving on to lesson number 5, which is decide what the message or theme of your story is before you start finalizing anything. Now, it's okay if the message changes or becomes clearer to you over development, but I wouldn't really recommend radically shifting the message of your story long after you've established the plot and characters, unless that shift coincides with said plot and characters. Also, I think it's smart to make your theme something that resonates with you personally. As in, don't write about something serious like historical events or social justice or anything like that if you don't have some experience with the subject or don't have anything to say about that stuff other than bad people who do bad things are bad. That's not a hard rule, of course. It's just that those types of themes are very complex and serious, and they're very difficult to get right. And I've just seen too many beginner storytellers screw them up in an attempt to make their stories seem deeper than they really are. Myself included. Plus, I just think there's a significantly greater chance people will enjoy the story you tell if they can tell that it's meaningful to you personally. Now on to lesson number 4. Prioritizing detailed backstories and in-universe lore typically leads to stalling on writing the story itself, or leads to filling the story with unnecessary bloat. I know this is a bit of a hot take, but I'm just reminding people this is not applicable to 15-year-old Casey who's just making complex lore with their OCs for fun and whimsy. This is just applicable if you want to tell a story through a book, webcomic, or TV show, or just any linear format like I tried to do. My take is that if you end up focusing too much on a character's backstory, you might as well just make that the actual story if you think it's more interesting than the character's present-day life. I mean, that's where all your efforts have gone towards anyway. When it comes to in-universe lore and world-building, though, I just don't really see the point in prioritizing it if it doesn't really affect the characters at all. I think stories are more interesting when they're about characters who make choices as opposed to expository summaries about the setting, which, any English teacher would also tell you that. Don't misconstrue my words, though. I'm obviously not saying to never world build for fun. I'm saying that if you want to make detailed world settings with complex lore, making a video game or a D&D session would probably be a better path than, a TV show. Okay, lesson number 3. Kill your darlings. Except, not as in kill off a lot of your characters like Game of Thrones style. I just mean don't create too many characters in the development process. Again, this is only applicable if you're trying to write a fiction story. For example, if you're making a fighting game, I don't care about how many characters you have. I'm gonna say if your main cast has over, 10 to 15 characters, you might want to cut some or merge some characters together to make the story more manageable for you and more digestible for an audience. Additionally, make sure that you're actually interested in the characters you create. Also, notice how I said to make them interesting and not likable. I mean, yeah, you could give your characters personalities you'd like, or give them personalities you'd like to play with. As in, making them annoying or make them evil, as long as it's something you're interested in exploring. This is typically why I'll merge characters together into one when I'm revamping a story, as it usually makes a more interesting character to combine two unrelated ones and figure out how their contrasting personalities would come together to make a cohesive person. Now on to lesson number 2. If you're just one person, keep the story short and sweet. Brevity is the soul of wit, as they say, and I'm inclined to believe that, especially if you like drawing the stories you write. I foolishly thought I could create 3 seasons of Lake Amenity, with each season having 10 to 12 episodes. Which, after it took me a year to draw everything for episode 1...
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
Yeah, it was quite a ridiculous goal to have in retrospect. Which, by the way, part of the length was the amount of characters I had, but also because, like I said, I just had too many ideas, and thought I could fit them all in. But sadly, the reality of creating fiction stories is knowing when some stuff needs to be left on the cutting room floor. Now we are here at lesson number 1, which is don't bite off more than you can chew. This has kinda ended up being the main thing I've learned from Lake Amenity. Like I've said countless times already, I decided to put enormous expectations on myself for no reason other than to prove to myself that I could do it. Which is like, hey, I still finished 20 minutes worth of art and visual storytelling all by myself, which is insane. But then with episode 2, it was like I crossed the finish line only to see another finish line in the distance. Which is kind of the trap of setting such high expectations for yourself, honestly. Also, taking breaks is good at any time, ever, at all. I hate when artists get overworked by studio executives, so I really shouldn't have been doing it to myself. So, I'm just putting this out there, but I don't want any other artists to think they need to overwork themselves and create something big in scope to be worth anything as a creator, because they don't, no matter how much capitalism might say otherwise. So maybe another thing some people might be wondering is, do I regret making Lake Amenity? The only negatives to creating something you don't entirely finish is the time you've lost, but even then, it's hard for me to think I wasted time when I still managed to learn so much from this project. Not to mention the lovely people I've met through making it. There's some people I still talk to after retiring Lake Amenity, and they're people I wouldn't have met without this project, so that's part of why I'm grateful. I also appreciate the sheer diversity in what I forced myself to draw for this series, especially all the damn backgrounds. I am very impressed with how much I learned when it comes to drawing backgrounds and creating appealing compositions within them, mostly because it helped me so much in creating the art that I make now, and truth be told, the art I make now is the proudest I've been with my craft in a long time. Not only do I feel like I'm making the art that I truly enjoy making, but I feel able to execute it in a way that aligns with what I see in my head. So no, I don't regret creating Lake Amenity. I may not like everything about it now, but I can't say I didn't learn from it. So, what's next for me? Am I gonna do any other big projects again or anything? Well, if you think I'm never creating OCs again, you're very wrong. I've been making OCs for probably as long as I've had the cognitive ability to imagine things at all. A habit like that doesn't go away that easy. You just might not see these new OCs being drawn as frequently as the Lake Amenity cast. Considering another bad habit I had with Lake Amenity was that since I wanted Lake Amenity to have a following, I decided that every drawing I made had to be about them somehow. It was yet another very dumb expectation for myself, and it's also another way in which I ended up with so much bloat in the story. Let's say I wanted to draw a cat. Well, there are no cats in Lake Amenity's story, but I can give a character a pet cat. Boom, now there's a random cat in the story that doesn't matter at all. That was a very common occurrence, which I don't want to repeat. So, I will reveal my new characters I've made in a moment, but, don't expect to see them much in the future unless I choose to make an in-depth video about them. Or, maybe I'll animate them for funsies like I did with Lake Amenity. These characters and their storylines are also still very much in the process of being developed. So anything I say about them and their designs are due to change in the future. I also don't really know if I'm gonna tell these stories yet. If I do, they'll likely be a comic format. I don't think I'm ever going to do a video format ever again. So if I do make anything with them, I will sure to mention it. So the first OC story I have to introduce you to is titled Escape from Everland. So when it comes to this story, we're going to start with the characters from Lake Amenity that I decided to completely revamp for this. What? You didn't honestly think that I'd have zero attachment remaining to this series all this time, right? So yeah, the characters I've kept are Archer, though renamed to Andy, Bo, Regan, and Silas. Bo and Regan might seem like new faces, but they were intended to appear later on in Lake Amenity's story. So these were the characters I had the most fun when writing them, so I wanted to keep them around and expand on their stories. Despite the setting and plot being altered from Lake Amenity though, I'd say this still takes place in a fantasy-adjacent setting. However, I think the real world also exists too, which is where Andy and Silas came from. I guess people call these kinds of settings isekais now, so yeah, that's what this is. Anyway, the protagonist is Andy, who starts the story by escaping his relationship to Silas, and then it's largely about his subsequent recovery with Bo. Regan serves as a supporting role for all three of those characters, but she's also got her own agendas, as you can probably tell by her smug expression. I still need to flesh this story out more, because this is probably the story I've worked on the least in the past year. The title is also just a placeholder for now. A lot of the stuff about this story is due to change. Now, the next story I want to tell you about is something I called Life Beyond Ruin. Now, this is the one I've probably worked on the most. It's kind of a zombie apocalypse story, but I aim to make it more on the hopeful end of the spectrum, as opposed to, like, The Walking Dead. The protagonist and deuteragonist are named Draven and August, respectively. They've somehow managed to survive the rising temperature of the Earth and increase in flooding everywhere by relying on each other. So Draven and August live semi-comfortably in this swampy apocalypse until they meet a wildlife biologist, and they ask for help by getting Draven to deliver several research papers to a city that Draven believed had sunken under the water. Though it's largely about Draven and August's journey together as they uncover new things about each other and meet several unique survivors on their path. That's the gist of what this story is about. I could say more about it, but it's still in the early stages, so I don't want to say too much since everything's subject to change when it comes to my writing process. Now, on to the third story I've worked on the most, which is something called Mortistown. I'm probably going to be a little more tight-lipped on this one, since it's a bit heavier in terms of themes, and much like the others, it's still very early in development and subject to change. So, the themes I wanted to explore with this one are mostly familial grief, childhood trauma, and recovery. It takes place in a town literally haunted by spirits which no one wants to acknowledge, but the protagonist, Chansey, wants to do something about it to make them go away. Though part of Chansey's motivation is to find the spirit of their dead sister and hopefully receive some closure for her mysterious death. Also, Chansey's not named after the Pokemon or anything. The name just kinda came to me as a derivative of the name Chance. Anyway, they recruit their childhood friend Tinsel and this new kid called Domino to help them. But things quickly spiral out of Chansey's control. Suddenly, they're put into a terrifying situation which leaves them questioning their worldview and not knowing who they can trust. Which is about all I'll say about that one for now. So yeah, there you have it. Those are some of the new characters I have in the works, which you may see pop up every now and then. Hopefully listening to me ramble about my creative journey like this, helped you in some way, or, just gave you some insight on what that whole Lake Amenity thing was about. Thank you if you watched the whole way through. This feels like an incredibly self-indulgent video to make, so I appreciate those who sat down to listen. Lord only knows this is going to be way longer than I initially planned. Anyway, subscribe or don't. Obviously, if you've seen episode 1, you would obviously know that. Just a subtle plug to go watch episode 1 because I put so much goddamn effort in it, oh my god! Anyway.